Hello everyone, my name is Jockey Prophet, and welcome to a little deviation from my usual. As I was playing through Devil May Cry 3, a little boomer shooter called Warhammer Boltgun came to my attention, and as I'm a gigantic fucking 40k fan, and a little bit of a shooter appreciator in general, I decided to give it a go. So, how is it? Does it live up to the strength of what is objectively a pretty fucking awesome concept? Well, let's discover, my friends, as we embark together on a Warhammer Boltgun review. So, starting off with the quickest and easiest to describe element first, Boltgun's story is about as simple as it gets. You're a space marine being deployed by a member of the Inquisition's Ordo Malleus in order to cleanse a world of the tainted chaos. Your fellow squad members die in a crash, psychically engineered by a chaos sorcerer, and it's up to you to find him, and to end him. That's pretty much it. The game is an ode to boomer shooters after all, so if the story is any more complex than big guy go place kill demon, then somehow you fucked up. And that's hardly to the game's detriment. It knows exactly what it's doing and it does it well. With the slight caveat that I think the sorcerer could have used a few more appearances, or at least a cutscene to really soak us in that maniacal campy bad guy thing he's got going on, but that's fine. That's a really minor complaint. As for relating to the wider Warhammer lore, apart from sharing some cool links with the Space Marine game, which I also really need to fucking play, it feels like it pays homage and shows love to the lore, but doesn't really work within it. The idea of a single pretty strong guy with cool guns killing a great unclean one, an avatar of disease and plague within the universe, is pretty ridiculous within the setting. And while the use of these greater demons as mini-bosses is kind of cool, I can't help but think that there would be just as interesting lesser beasts of Nurgle and Tzeentch that would make much more sense for this single Space Marine to be killing. But then again, it's kinda splitting hairs, that complaint, and this entire game does show a lot of love and appreciation for the lore, and sometimes that's just how it should be. Long live Rule of Cool, after all. Now, as far as gameplay goes, I think everyone would agree that the most important aspect for a game like this to absolutely nail would be the combat. And for the most part, Boltgun passes with flying colours. Make no mistake, this is a fun-ass game, as you're given a diverse and fun range of tools to blast away the heretics with. For example, there's the standard issue Boltgun, which is given this grand entrance and almost treated as its own character, and it pulverizes most weaker enemies with a single shot. Then there's the combat shotgun, which easily clears away most enemies unlucky enough to get within close range. The heavy bolter, plasma gun, vengeance launcher, volkite caliber, melter gun, and last but certainly not least, the grav cannon. All of these weapons have unique strengths and weaknesses tied to their ammo capacity, range, and lastly their strength value. See, in an homage to the tabletop game Boltgun is based on, each weapon has its own individual strength value, which is pitted against an enemy's toughness value. Attacks with double the enemy's toughness deal double damage, attacks with less than double but still greater than the enemy's toughness deal bonus damage, and attacks even with the toughness value deal no bonus damage whatsoever. And vice versa for enemies with higher toughness than your weapon's strength. This is a pretty fun system overall, and does force these otherwise all equally ridiculous weapons into their own special niches. The bolt gun and shotgun are best for clearing hordes of minor enemies, and the grav cannon and volkite caliber make great tank busters, etc. Most of the weapons feel very good to use, and for the most part I really don't have any issues with them, save for the minor issues I have with the plasma gun, which in an interesting design move suffers from the same problem as its tabletop counterpart, in that it will overheat and deal damage to the player if fired too many times in succession. I get the idea here, it's a cool homage to the tabletop game and creates this really interesting risk versus reward dynamic with what would otherwise be one of the game's strongest weapons. However, this limitation has the opposite effect in my opinion. The pros of using this weapon don't really outweigh the massive con of damage being dealt to the player, especially on those really crushing higher difficulty modes, and as such it ends up feeling like a completely redundant part of your arsenal, especially when you get things like the volkite caliber and grav cannon later on. As for the rest of your combat tools, you have a chainsword, which can be used to finish off low health enemies, which feels great, but doesn't have any actual benefit to combat to incentivize you to use it. It drops no extra health or armor armor as far as I can tell, and doesn't even grant you invulnerability while you do it. So it's not even technically a finisher animation. And honestly, it ends up just feeling like a very fun but superfluous feature that can even make the game harder if you try to go for them consistently. You then get a decent enough dash that's sometimes a bit annoying to aim, but that will instantly splatter most weaker enemies, which is really fucking fun. I mean, a general part of this game that I really enjoy, and that is generally very widely complimented about it, is you get a great feeling of the Space Marine's weight. This giant fucking fridge motherfucker that just barrels through enemies using his, like, fucking tank armor. And I wish there were more examples of that being used beyond the excellent sound design of him thunking everywhere, and obviously the thing with the dash and the if you drop from far enough on enemies you squash them. Yeah, generally the weight of the Space Marine is really well done in this game, and that's one of my favourite things about it. There are then the grenades of the two major varieties, one with a delayed timer that deals more damage, and another which activates on impact but has a small blast radius. Switching between these two and using them strategically adds a fun little layer to combat, though you are limited to a few instead of having them just be on cooldown, which I think is a bit of a shame, as generally you aren't really entering into that many situations where limiting the amount of grenades you have, apart from the really fucking overpowered void grenade, actually adds that much to combat, and I think it would be more fun if you could just kind of spam them on cooldown, but again, that's just probably a me thing. Finally, there's this really fun last stand type of mechanic, which is on cooldown, which basically works by having you, after taking a potentially lethal amount of damage, the Marine enters this invincibility state for a few seconds, which is incredibly useful if you use it strategically for those clutch saving yourself and finding a health pack at 1 health point moments, but is balanced well, genuinely, and doesn't last too long so that the combat retains this constant sense of tension. Honestly, outside of some very minor complaints, the player's arsenal and tools to deal with combat scenarios are very fun and varied. The combat generally flows very well, with a few exceptions, but I'll get to those. And the only real major complaint I have, outside of what I've already mentioned, is the issue of really poor damage communication. It's often difficult to tell if you're taking damage, and if so, how much, without keeping a constant eye on your HP stat, which is nigh impossible in more demanding, higher difficulty fights. And this has the effect of meaning it's difficult to measure risk versus reward in some situations, which generally makes the strategy within the fights feel a little bit less active, but that's really, again, another minor complaint. The other major complaint I have is the lack of mobility in combat. It doesn't really feel like the game wants you to sit still and tank through attacks like a walking arsenal, which you might expect from the sheer emphasis on the weight of the Space Marine that I mentioned earlier. But at the same time, there's rarely any fun ways to maneuver around your combat environments other than just kind of sprinting around them, as the jump can oftentimes be quite unreliable and buggy, and generally that's one of my main complaints with this game, is that for the amount of it that relies so heavily on platforming across, like, you know, very small platforms, considering you are literally a fridge, the jump is effectively your fridge moves like a fucking leopard, but it's a leopard with the weight of a fridge that's also been coated in fucking baby oil, and you slip and slide all over the place, which is generally just not very satisfying, and I do think makes the platforming unnecessarily frustrating. There are jump pads in this game. It does introduce a jump pad mechanic at the end of Act 2, but they don't really do anything with it, and it barely shows up in any combat encounters, which I think is really unfortunate. I think this game could have genuinely really benefited for some more verticality and general just ability to move within fights, you know? But overall, despite all of those, you know, little minor bitching things I have to say, yeah, generally the combat is really fucking fun. Boltgun's enemy design is also pretty strong as far as I'm concerned. Lesser mob enemies like the cultists and small demons feel suitably squishy and only really have one or two ways to exert pressure on the player, but they can still be really deadly if left in unchecked numbers. I especially like the fact that despite being firmly one-shottable goon territory, the cultists have an array of weapons that present an array of problems for the player. For example, there's these cultists that have plasma guns, which produce an explosion when killed with a specific timing. So if you're a careful player, you can choose to use these to your advantage and set off like a massive chain reaction of explosions, which kill a bunch of enemies for free. Or if you're not really paying attention to these plasma gun cultists and blow one up haphazardly while he's standing right next to you, you can get exploded and lose like half your fucking health. Which I don't know, I just think that's a really fun way to design a lesser enemy. Still, you know, keeping the whole they're a one-shottable goon, they shouldn't be able to exert that much pressure on you, but still making them interesting and having them present a set challenge for the player. Then there's the Chaos Marines, which are a masterclass in striking enemy design all their own, capable of applying pressure to the player in multiple ways without ever really being too oppressive unless the player deals with them incorrectly. For example, they can shoot at you from far away, they can toss grenades to make small areas of the arena inaccessible for a bit. Hell, they can even melee you, which is really fun if you stand too close to them, haphazardly just shooting them. There's also the Terminators, which act as terrifyingly unstoppable tanks that you can only deal with by spamming the most powerful anti-tank weapon you have and praying while they fire an avalanche of bolt rounds your way. Yeah, for the most part, all of the Chaos Marine designs are really fun and distinct. My problems start to begin with the demon designs though. Particularly the Flamers, Plague Toads, Bloat Drones, and Screamers. And my problem with them is, essentially, none of them are really that unique. Both the forces of Nurgle and Tzeentch have 2 long-range artillery units, both of which have more tanky variants, and then they have their flying units, with the only unique difference between these flying units being their toughness, and one of them being ranged and one of them being melee. The problem I have with this is that in the lore, Nurgle and Tzeentch are 2 very different and diametrically opposed gods, and none of the demon designs working under them really seem to reflect this beyond the Nurglings and horrors. Now, considering that, for example, Tzeentch is the god of sorcery and trickery, the Flamers don't really have any sorcery or trickery to them. They just sort of stand at range and do fire blasts at you, and that's all they do. The Screamers just sort of hover and fly around your head, and that's it. The Plague Toads are a bit better, because at least they can poison certain areas of the ground, and yeah, they're still just a bit bland and lacking in personality, and lacking in differentiation from the other designs, I think. And going back to the thing I was talking about before, about having varied ways to put pressure on the player, I don't really feel that the Plague Toads and the Flamers, more specifically I will say that these complaints go more for the Tzeentch units, as some of the Nurgle units do have varied ways to put pressure on you, like the Plague Toads will both lick you and spit fucking globules of acid your way, whereas the Flamers will just kind of stand still and do fire blast at you. It's a real shame, considering that there was so much potential for more fun design concepts here, and that only really works to worsen the other main problem with the enemies in this game. That being that, considering the game's length, there aren't really enough of them. You meet all of the main enemy varieties by I think the midway point of Act 2, which means that you spend over half the game just fighting the same recycled enemies over and over, leaving a good chunk of the experience just feeling criminally lacking in variety, which compiles on top of a lot of problems, which I'll get onto. In terms of the boss designs, they're just sort of big hit sponges with a few unique features per one. There's the Lord of Change, which have a bunch of fun abilities like teleportation and raining meteors from the sky, but also have an equal amount of unfun bullshit like this damage you as long as you're in its line of sight move, which doesn't really work well with the game's very poor damage communication and also tends to be a little bit glitchy in my experience. On the whole, it's still fun to fight the first time you do it, but definitely becomes tedious after about 7 repetitions of the same fight, with no greater strategy involved other than just shoot it till it dies. Which is honestly the prevailing feeling I could give about most of these bosses. The Great Unclean one is a lot more actively frustrating simply because of how much of a bullet sponge it is and how rapidly it spawns its little nurgling helpers. Its attacks also deal an insane amount of damage for how difficult they are to avoid, but that might just be me being fucking shit at the game. And also, generally, it just isn't that fun. The Ancient Amble is there, and it's in the game. And that's about all I can think to say about it. Which finally leaves us with the Sorcerer, who suffers from a mix of the problems that the other two suffer from, but generally feels more like an annoying stage hazard in your boss fights with him, more than an actual present threat. The main problem with these 3 fights, in my opinion, is just a lack of mechanics and fun attacks to break up the monotony of the player simply running around and killing the basic enemies they spawn for health points, taking a few pot shots at them with your strongest weapon, and then rinse repeating until completion. A point best proven by the final fight with the Sorcerer, which happens to be the best fight in the game game because it adds some fun mechanics to break up gameplay, specifically his invulnerability mechanic being dependent on you dispatching certain enemies in order to get opportunities to damage him. It's not an amazing design by any stretch of the imagination. I've been very, very upfront about the fact that I really don't like gimmick designs like this, but at least it adds a few extra layers onto gameplay, which is enough to have it stand out from the other bullet sponges. Yeah, overall boss design isn't great, and is only hurt more by the game forcing you to fight them so many times repeatedly. I think it's like 7 or 8 times for the Lord of Change, 3, 4, maybe 5 Great Unclean Ones, and 3 fights with the Sorcerer. The level design honestly hits some very high highs and low lows across the game, I think. There's some really cool and well executed set pieces, like racing up the elevator against a rising tide of molten promethium at the start of Act 3. These beautifully work around and enhance the combat to produce really fun segments of gameplay. But its main level design strength is also its greatest weakness, though, as the game aims to ensure that the level designs really fit the gothic grandeur and whole insignificance of a single person thing the universe has going on, and as such, most of the levels feel far bigger than the player can reasonably explore, with winding corridors, vast open areas, and everything feeling generally way larger than what's reasonable, which, when it works, creates this really strong feeling of atmosphere and demonstrates the love for the universe that was put into this game. It also adds several unique layers to combat, with the player being able to use the grandness and verticality of the environments to their advantage, like luring enemies through winding corridors so that you can grade them more effectively. Just a bunch of strategy that can be accessed through using these environments properly, which is very fun. However, the main natural problem with this approach, though, has gotta be in the player's ability to know where the fuck they're supposed to go. There's all these twisty corridors and wide open areas that can easily become very confusing if not handled properly, especially when this is combined with the lack of a map or any strong objective locator. So levels like this one hypothetically really cool Zinchian maze just become unnecessarily frustrating and a real slog to get through, just slamming yourself through portals until you eventually escape. Now, I get that not having a map fits in with the whole grimdark vibe and keeps in tradition with boomer shooters, but yeah, I kinda think this game badly needs one, or at least to more clearly mark out where certain objectives are within a level. It could even be used to enhance shit, like the Zinchian maze. Like, imagine instead of just randomly trying portals, your map actively lied to you and pulled you through a series of enemy encounters linked to these portals. It'd be a fun little use of the game's core tools against the player, and would fit in perfectly with Zinch's sorceress trickster vibes as well. Progression, though, is I think one of this game's most glaring weak points, since there are no permanent health, contempt, or weapon upgrades, only the collection of individual weapons themselves and collectibles that can be found throughout the level, which have a variety of differing effects. Collecting the individual weapons is fun on the first playthrough, and each weapon's discovery is centered around a nice big arena, with plenty of ammo provided to give it a fitting test drive, so they work just fine. The problem, though, is that this is the only form of actual long-lasting progression you get over the course of the game, which means that it has to be spread over about 9 hours and 3 acts, which the game handles incredibly poorly, with weapons being relatively regular until about 2/3 of the way through Act 1, and then becoming far more sparsely introduced, which in and of itself is a minor problem. But then the game keeps inexplicably removing all of your weapons between acts to pad out this process, with you having to regain all of your arsenal after every act, which is just extremely fucking frustrating and an unfun way to put a band-aid over the game's massive fucking pacing problem, in my opinion. And it gets worse when you consider what could have been if the game wasn't so dedicated to being retro, with the possibility of something like Doom Eternal's weapon challenge system giving you permanent access to the machine spirits, instead of having them only be a once per level buff for one weapon. Which, by the way, side rant about the machine spirits, they are really not that fun. The base idea of getting a collectible which massively powers up one weapon for the remainder of a level isn't that bad in and of itself, but when combined with the massive pacing problem this game has in terms of progression, means that I get to have one specific weapon be great for one level, and then I have to immediately run back and collect the next machine spirit again. And I just don't think that's that fun of a way to encourage engagement with the level, in my opinion, but that could just be a me thing. My real problem, though, is the fact that most of the machine spirits are just not that fun. Like, for example, all the machine spirit for the bolt gun does is raise its strength a bit. And generally that's the running theme. None of these machine spirits, apart from the one for the shotgun and the plasma gun, really give any sort of like fun effect to the weapon you use. They're all just sort of basic strength upgrades or removing the weakness that's supposed to add any form of strategy to using the weapon you use. The heavy bolter's whole thing is that it will absolutely shred everything in front of you, but it makes you slower when you use it. However, the machine spirit completely removes that. So why would you use anything else? I don't know, I just don't think it's that fun. I think this could have been a much better implemented system, and I think something creative could have been done with this to do with actual weapon progression and rewarding loyalty to using certain weapons. Or just anything to give the player a more tangible sense of progression throughout the game, because the only tangible sense of progression you get throughout the game, the collection of the weapons gets taken from you at the beginning of every act, and you have to find all the fuckers again. I really do appreciate in games, especially in shooters, when you get a choice in how your characters plays and the weapons that you decide to upgrade, that actually more permanently rewards exploration and engagement with the game's levels. Honestly, generally speaking, the collectibles in Boltgun are a bit of a massive problem for me. Like, none of them really do anything fun. There's the basic sort of, oh, you do more damage in melee, but you don't one-shot things in melee or get like a fun, like, brutally ripping the enemy to shreds animation like you do in Doom with the Berserk power-up. It's just sort of, oh, well, now you do more damage with your chainsaw. And then you get the, oh, well, now I have infinite ammo, which, yeah, it's kind of fun, and that's the most fun of the pickups that you get. Just generally, I really feel that the collectibles could use with some work, especially with how much the game clearly wants you to go for them. It doesn't really feel like you're rewarded that heavily for going to pick them up. And don't get me wrong, I think a lot more of these things would be fine and more excusable if the game was about half its current length, and so there wasn't really as much of a need to have some sort of progression to keep the player invested. But considering we already have enemies being repeated, level design kind of starting to drag out, this problem with progression really starts to affect the game negatively, in my opinion. It must be said though, on a much more positive note, this game does look absolutely stunning. Pixel art supremacy, after all. The game does an amazing job of both capturing that retro Doom 64 feel and creating a vibrant, well, as close to vibrant as you get in Warhammer, and detailed world. All of the environments have this wonderful sense of age and character injected into their presentation, which demonstrates this definite passion and love for the universe that was pumped into the game. Similarly, all of the enemy sprites are really well detailed and pumped full of more personality than you'd initially expect. Like the jeering of the Chaos Space Marines if they kill you, or the festering pustules of the Great Unclean One. Although the game for the most part does look great, the pixel art style does have a few limitations, and some areas of the game, particularly the Ambol tunnels, can feel occasionally a bit devoid of personality and bland. As far as the music goes though, it fucking bangs. I mean, just listen to this shit. As does the equally important sound design, because holy shit, the way these guns sound brings neuron activation beyond belief, and I think that adds 2 points onto my ranking of this game alone. In terms of general presentation, it's just a very well put together game in my opinion. So what's my conclusion? Boltgun is a really good game, but it's held back by some major issues. I think it doesn't really know what it wants to be. For example, the retro shooters that it's trying and mostly succeeding to emulate are all mostly very short experiences. For example, Doom 1 clocks in at 5 hours, Doom 64 at 7, Quake at 5.5. Meanwhile, Boltgun clocks in at a comparatively large 9.5 hours on average, with nothing really filling that time up, actually, compared to something like Doom in terms of meaningful progression or enemy variety, and the cracks really do start to show. There are quite a few missions which honestly should be axed from the game, and the experience would remain largely unchanged in my opinion, as well as either a lot more options for progression or progression that was better spaced out along the game's 9.5 hour runtime. I think it's a shame too, because as good as the gameplay is, I found it a little repetitive by the start of Act 3, simply because just of the lack of new elements being introduced to keep me engaged. And the only thing that kept me going is the pretty solid level design, especially near the end. But those problems pretty much killed off any desire I really had to replay the game at all. That and the lack of a platinum trophy or hint, hint, nudge, nudge. Overall, while I have sounded pretty negative here, I do just want to say, I still do love this game. It's far and away one of the best Warhammer games available, and just a damn good shooter in general. I just think that it has a few critical and really irksome flaws that hold it back from being absolute perfection. Regardless of all that, fellas, I hope you're all well, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one. We'll be back with either Devil May Cry 4 or some more shit talking about Dororo soon, but bye bye for now.